There are moments in war when everyone discovers who they really are. For some, it happens in the first seconds of contact. For others, it takes years. But on a dust-choked afternoon in eastern Afghanistan, an entire infantry platoon learned something they should have known from the start. The quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous.
They called her Doc, not out of respect, not at first anyway, just habit. Standard military shorthand for the medic who walked at the center of the patrol, carrying more weight than most of them and saying less than anyone. She was small, soft-spoken, and according to the young specialists who thought they knew better, probably not cut out for the kind of missions they ran outside the wire.
They were about to learn how wrong they were, and some of them would only survive long enough to realize it because she refused to let them die. The sun hung low over Forward Operating Base Blackstone, turning the dust in the air to gold and making the HESCO barriers cast long, jagged shadows across the gravel motor pool. A Chinook helicopter thumped somewhere beyond the perimeter, its rotor wash kicking up grit that stung exposed skin and made everyone squint. 2nd Platoon, Bravo Company, formed up in 2 ragged lines near the gate, waiting for the patrol brief to finish and the order to step outside the wire. Rifles were locked and loaded. Helmets sat low on sweat-dampened heads. The familiar weight of body armor pressed down on shoulders that had carried it through too many missions to count. Standing near the center of the formation was Specialist Emily Carter. At 27, she looked younger. Something about her face, maybe, or the way she stood. She was 5'3" on a good day, lean and wiry in a way that made her look almost out of place among the bigger, broader infantrymen surrounding her. Her sleeves were rolled tight against forearms that seemed too small to carry the massive aid bag strapped to her back, a pack that weighed north of 40 pounds and contained everything needed to keep a human being alive when their body was trying to give up. She adjusted the strap without looking up, fingers moving with the kind of automatic precision that comes from doing something 1,000 times. Her eyes stayed forward, scanning the gate, the road beyond, the distant ridgeline where the mountains met the sky. Behind her, a voice muttered, just loud enough to carry, "Hope she can keep up once we're outside the wire." A few low chuckles followed, not cruel, just dismissive, the kind of comment that gets tossed around before a patrol when nerves are high and everyone's looking for something to ease the tension.
She's just a medic, man. Probably hasn't even fired her weapon outside the range. More laughter. Quiet, brief. But Emily heard it. She always heard it. She didn't respond, didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing the words had landed. She just kept her eyes forward and her breathing steady, the same way she'd done on her first deployment and every mission since.
The platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Marcus Reyes, a broad-shouldered veteran with a scar running down his jawline and eyes that had seen too much, heard the exchange. He glanced at Emily, then at the soldiers behind her. He opened his mouth like he might say something, then thought better of it. The laughter died on its own, swallowed by the weight of what came next. Because in 30 minutes, they'd be outside the wire, and out there, jokes didn't mean much. Out there, the only thing that mattered was whether you could do your job when everything went to hell. Emily Carter had already proven she could. They just didn't know it yet. She'd grown up in a place most people drove through without stopping, a small town in eastern Kentucky, where the hills were steep, the roads were narrow, and Friday nights meant high school football under lights that flickered when the wind blew too hard. Her father worked in the mines, her mother cleaned houses, and her older brother, Daniel, had enlisted in the Army right out of high school, deploying to Iraq in 2006. He'd been killed 3 months into his tour, IED en route Irish, dead before the medevac even arrived. Emily had been 15 when the chaplain and the notification officer showed up at their door. She'd watched her mother collapse in the hallway, watched her father's hands shake as he tried to hold the folded flag they handed him. She'd stood there in her school uniform,
numb and silent, while the officer recited words that were supposed to mean something, but only felt hollow.
Daniel had bled out on a dusty road in Baghdad, and nobody had been able to stop it. Nobody had been close enough. Nobody had known how. Emily enlisted 2 years later, the day after she turned 17, with her parents' reluctant signature on the waiver form. She didn't want to carry a rifle. She didn't want to kick down doors or call in airstrikes. She wanted to be the person who ran toward the wounded instead of away from them, the person who could stop the bleeding, the person who could give someone a chance when there shouldn't be one. So she became a medic, not because she thought she could save everyone, but because she refused to stand by and do nothing when someone's life was slipping away. The training had been brutal. Combat medicine wasn't about bedside manner or taking vitals in a sterile hospital room. It was about making life or death decisions in seconds, under fire, with incomplete information and hands that wouldn't stop shaking until you forced them to. It was about learning to think while the world exploded around you, to prioritize when everyone needed help, to accept that sometimes doing everything right still wasn't enough. She'd graduated at the top of her class, deployed to Afghanistan for the first time at 19, and on her first deployment, assigned to a Marine unit operating in Helmand Province, she'd done things that earned her a commendation she never talked about, and a reputation she'd spent the last 3 years trying to escape. Because Emily Carter didn't want to be a hero. She didn't want the attention or the stories or the weight of expectation. She just wanted to do her job, keep her head down, and bring as many people home alive as she could. But war doesn't care what you want. And on this deployment, her second tour, this time attached to an Army light infantry platoon, she was about to be reminded of that in the worst way possible. The patrol stepped through the gate at 1600 hours, the sun still high, but starting its slow descent toward the mountains. The moment they crossed outside the wire, the world changed. The noise of the FOB, generators, radios, distant laughter, faded behind them, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more watchful. The village of Qalat Shar spread out ahead of them, a maze of mud brick compounds and narrow alleyways that twisted and turned like a labyrinth designed to swallow intruders whole. Walls rose on either side, 10 feet high in some places, cutting off sight lines and creating perfect ambush points. Power lines sagged overhead, heavy with dust. Somewhere, a dog barked, sharp and frantic. The platoon moved in staggered column formation, 2 parallel lines on either side of the road, spacing themselves to minimize casualties if an IED went off. Staff Sergeant Reyes walked near the front, his rifle up, scanning rooftops and windows with the kind of focus that came from muscle memory. Behind him, the squad automatic weapon gunner, a thick-shouldered private named Jake Holloway, swept left and right, finger resting just outside the trigger guard. Emily moved with the center element, her aid bag shifting with each step, straps cutting into her shoulders. She kept her rifle slung low across her chest, muzzle angled down, safety on. Her attention wasn't on threats. That was the infantry's job. Her attention was on the soldiers around her, watching their movements, noting who was limping, who was favoring one side, who looked pale or dehydrated. She was already doing triage in her head, prioritizing who she'd reach first if something went wrong. Because something always went wrong. It was just a question of when. Overwatch, this is Bravo 2-1. We're at checkpoint Alpha. No contact. Proceeding to Bravo. They pushed deeper into the village, boots crunching on gravel and broken stone. The locals watched from doorways and rooftops, women in headscarves, old men with weathered faces, children who stared with wide, unblinking eyes. Emily noticed a boy, maybe 10 years old, standing on a second-story balcony. He wasn't looking at the platoon. He was looking past them, towards something down the alley. Her instincts prickled. She keyed her radio, voice low. Sergeant Reyes, kid at 2 o'clock, elevated position. He's watching something. Reyes glanced up, saw the boy, and gave a subtle hand signal. The platoon tightened slightly, spacing adjusted, weapons came up a fraction. Nothing overt, just a shift in posture that said, "We see it too." The boy disappeared inside.
They kept moving. 30 seconds later, the world exploded. The first burst of gunfire came from the rooftop on their left, a sharp, crackling string of AK-47 rounds that chewed into the dirt 2 feet from the lead element. Dust jumped. Someone shouted, "Contact left!" and the entire platoon dropped into cover like a choreographed dance they'd practiced 100 times.
Emily was on one knee behind a low wall before her brain even registered the sound. Her rifle came up instinctively, though she didn't fire. Her job wasn't to shoot unless absolutely necessary. Her job was to watch for casualties. And there was one already.
Private First Class David Chen, a 20-year-old kid from San Diego who'd been in country for all of 6 weeks, stumbled backward, clutching his right shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark and fast.
Emily moved before anyone gave the order. She crossed the 5 feet of open ground in a crouch, sliding in beside Chen as rounds snapped overhead. She grabbed his arm, pulled it away from the wound, and assessed in 2 seconds. Through and through, no arterial bleed, no bone fragments visible.
"You're good," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It's a clean graze. Stay with me." She pulled a pressure dressing from her kit, ripped it open with her teeth, and applied it with practiced efficiency. Chen's breathing was fast, panicked. She locked eyes with him. "David, look at me. You're fine. Breathe." He nodded, jaw clenched, and she could see him forcing himself to calm down. She secured the dressing, checked his pulse, elevated but stable, and gave Reyes a thumbs up. "He's good to move." Reyes acknowledged with a nod and adjusted the squad's position to return fire. The gunfire from the rooftop slackened as the platoon's suppressive fire forced the shooter to take cover.
Emily helped Chen shift behind better cover, then scanned the rest of the platoon. Everyone else was still up, still moving, for now. The private who joked about her keeping up was staring at her, mouth slightly open. She didn't look at him. She was already repositioning, scanning for the next casualty, the next problem, the next thing that needed fixing. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The enemy shooter melted away into the maze of buildings, disappearing before they could pinpoint his exact position. Silence settled again, heavy and ringing. Reyes keyed his radio. "Overwatch, Bravo 2-1. Contact at checkpoint Bravo. 1 friendly wounded, minor. Enemy broke contact. Continuing mission." They pushed forward, tension coiling tighter with every step. Behind Emily, one of the soldiers whispered to another, "Did you see that? She didn't even hesitate." "Yeah," the other replied quietly. "Maybe we should shut the hell up." Emily didn't hear them, or if she did, she didn't care. She was already watching the next alley, the next rooftop, the next shadow that might hide someone waiting to kill them. Because the first contact was never the last. And she knew, deep in her bones, in the part of her that had survived Helmand Province and nights that still woke her up in cold sweats, that the real fight hadn't even started yet. They moved deeper into the village, every sense on high alert. The narrow alleyways pressed in from both sides, creating natural choke points that made Emily's skin crawl. These weren't streets. They were kill zones waiting to happen. Mud brick walls rose 10, 12 feet high, blocking sight lines and creating perfect cover for ambushes. Overhead, sagging power lines and laundry stretched between buildings like cobwebs. The platoon's formation had tightened after the first contact. Nobody was joking now. Boots moved more carefully, avoiding debris that might conceal pressure plates. Eyes tracked windows and rooftops with razor focus. The radio chatter had dropped to essential communications only. Grid coordinates, movement reports, terse acknowledgments. Emily walked in her position near the center, her aid bag feeling heavier with each step. The adrenaline from treating Chen was fading, leaving behind the familiar cocktail of exhaustion and hypervigilance that defined life outside the wire. Her left forearm ached, where the old scar ran from wrist to elbow, a thick, ropey line of tissue from shrapnel that had torn through her arm on her first deployment. The scar had a habit of hurting before things went bad, like a weather vane for violence. She flexed her fingers, working out the stiffness, and kept moving. Ahead, Staff Sergeant Reyes raised a fist, the signal to halt. The platoon froze. He pointed 2 fingers at his eyes, then at a compound on their right. Something had caught his attention. Emily followed his gaze and saw it. Fresh dirt near the base of a wall, disturbed in a way that didn't match the surrounding ground, the kind of disturbance that screamed IED. Reyes keyed his radio, voice barely above a whisper. Overwatch, possible IED at our position, requesting route clearance. The response came back tense. Negative on clearance, team. They're engaged 2 clicks north. You're on your own. Proceed with caution or find alternate route. Emily watched Reyes's jaw tighten. Finding an alternate route meant backtracking through territory they'd already passed, exposing themselves to ambush from behind. Proceeding meant gambling that the disturbed dirt was nothing. Neither option was good. Reyes made the call. We push through, stay wide, watch your spacing. They moved in single file, hugging the opposite wall, giving the suspicious patch of ground as much distance as possible. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she passed it, waiting for the explosion that would turn the alley into a cloud of shrapnel and screaming. It didn't come. 20 feet past the disturbed earth, the platoon spread out again, collective breath releasing. False alarm. Or maybe the bomb wasn't armed yet. Or maybe they'd just gotten lucky. In Afghanistan, you never knew which. They rounded a bend, and the alley opened into a small courtyard, maybe 30 feet across, with compounds on 3 sides and a narrow exit on the 4th. It was quieter here. No locals visible. No movement. Just the oppressive stillness that preceded violence, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Emily's instincts screamed at her. This was wrong. This was a trap. She opened her mouth to say something, and the world exploded into chaos. The ambush came from 3 directions simultaneously. Gunfire erupted from the rooftops on both sides and from a 2nd-story window overlooking the courtyard. It was coordinated, professional, designed to catch them in a crossfire with nowhere to run. Rounds tore into the dirt, the walls, the air itself. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of a PKM machine gun, its heavy rounds chewing through the mud brick like it was paper. "Ambush! Ambush!" someone screamed, and the platoon scattered for cover. Emily threw herself behind a low wall that barely came up to her chest. Beside her, Private Jake Holloway, the saw gunner, returned fire in controlled bursts, his weapon barking loud enough to make her ears ring even through her hearing protection. Across the courtyard, she saw Private First Class Marcus Williams go down hard, his rifle clattering away as he hit the ground. He tried to get up, made it halfway, then collapsed again. Blood bloomed dark across his right thigh. "Man down," someone shouted. Emily didn't think. She moved. She launched herself from behind the wall and sprinted across the courtyard in a low crouch, her aid bag bouncing violently against her spine. Rounds snapped past her head, close enough that she felt the air displacement, close enough that later she'd find a bullet hole through her sleeve. She reached Williams and dropped beside him, her hands already moving. Femoral artery, the worst kind of leg wound. If she didn't stop the bleeding in the next 60 seconds, he'd bleed out in 3 minutes. "Tourniquet," she yelled, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe. Williams was conscious but going into shock, his face pale and sweating. His eyes found hers, wide with fear. "Doc, I can't, my leg." "You're staying with me, Marcus," she said, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "Look at me. Not your leg. Me." She pulled her own tourniquet from her kit, wrapped it high on his thigh. above the wound, tight against the groin, and started cranking the windlass. Williams screamed. She kept cranking. Blood flow slowed, then stopped.
Around them, the firefight intensified. The PKM machine gun hammered away from the rooftop, forcing the platoon to stay pinned behind inadequate cover. Someone threw a smoke grenade, and gray-white clouds began to billow across the courtyard, providing momentary concealment.
Emily used it. She grabbed Williams under the arms and started dragging him backward toward the wall where the rest of the squad had taken cover. He was bigger than her, at least 180 pounds with gear, and every inch was a battle. Her boots slipped in the dirt. Her shoulders screamed. The aid bag felt like it weighed 100 pounds.
She didn't stop. Halfway across the courtyard, another soldier went down. Specialist Tyler Brooks, the one who joked about her not keeping up, took a round to the upper arm and spun sideways, dropping behind a pile of rubble. Emily saw it happen, saw the way he clutched his arm, saw the blood. 2 casualties now, and the medevac helicopter was at least 15 minutes out, assuming it could even land in a hot LZ.
She dragged Williams the last few feet to cover and handed him off to another soldier. Keep pressure on that tourniquet. Monitor his breathing. If he goes unconscious, tell me immediately. Then she turned and ran back into the kill zone. The smoke was thicker now, providing some concealment, but making it almost impossible to see. Emily moved through it like a ghost, following the sound of Brooks's labored breathing. She found him slumped against a wall, his left arm hanging useless, blood running between his fingers.
"Brooks, let me see it," she said, kneeling beside him. He looked at her, and for a second she saw something in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or recognition. "Doc, I'm sorry. I didn't—" "Save it." She cut him off. "Show me the arm."
The wound was bad, but not catastrophic. The round had torn through the bicep, missing bone and major arteries, but creating a nasty through and through that was bleeding heavily. She packed it with gauze, applied a pressure dressing, and wrapped it tight enough to make him wince.
"You're good," she said. "Can you move?" He nodded, teeth clenched. "Then move. Get behind that wall and stay there." Brooks stumbled to his feet and made it to cover just as another burst of gunfire tore through the space where he'd been sitting.
Emily crouched low, scanning the courtyard. The smoke was starting to clear. She could see Reyes coordinating fire from behind a column, directing soldiers to suppress the rooftop positions. The platoon was holding, but barely. They were pinned, ammunition running low, and the enemy showed no signs of breaking contact.
And then Emily heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold. The distinctive whoosh crack of a rocket-propelled grenade being fired. She looked up just in time to see the rocket arc across the courtyard and slam into the MRAP vehicle they'd left parked at the entrance to the alley. The explosion was massive, a bloom of fire and black smoke that shook the ground and sent shrapnel screaming through the air. The vehicle's fuel tank caught, and secondary explosions started rippling through it. Flames leapt 20 feet into the air. 2 soldiers who'd been using it for cover were thrown backward by the blast. Emily saw them go down, saw one of them try to get up and fail, saw the other one not move at all. The radio crackled with panicked voices. "RPG! RPG! We've got casualties by the vehicle!" Staff Sergeant Reyes's voice cut through the chaos. Emily looked at the burning vehicle, looked at the open ground between her position and the casualties, looked at the rooftop where the PKM was still hammering away. Crossing that ground was suicide. The gunner had a clear line of sight. There was no cover, no concealment, nothing but 30 feet of open dirt and certain death. She keyed her radio. "I'm going." "Doc, wait for covering fire," Reyes started to say, but Emily was already running. She moved faster than she'd ever moved in her life, legs pumping, lungs burning, every muscle screaming at her to stop, to dive for cover, to do anything except keep running toward the burning vehicle and the wounded soldiers lying in its shadow. The PKM gunner saw her. She heard the gun's cadence shift.
heard the rounds tracking toward her, heard them hitting the dirt in a line that was closing fast. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. A round snapped past her head so close she felt the heat. 4 steps, 5.
Another round tore through her sleeve, missing flesh by millimeters.
6 steps, 7. And then she was there, sliding the last few feet on her knees, coming to a stop beside the first casualty. It was Corporal James Martinez, a veteran on his 3rd deployment, a father of 2. He was unconscious, his helmet cracked, blood running from his ears, traumatic brain injury, possible internal bleeding. Bad.
Emily checked his airway, clear. Breathing, shallow but present. Pulse, weak but there. She rolled him into recovery position, secured his airway, and marked him as priority evacuation. The second casualty was worse.
Private Danny Foster, 21 years old, from rural Georgia, who'd shown Emily pictures of his fiancée just that morning, was conscious, but barely. A piece of shrapnel had torn into his abdomen, and blood was pooling beneath him, dark and spreading fast.
Emily's hands moved on autopilot. Abdominal wound, penetrating trauma, possible internal organ damage. She needed to control the bleeding, stabilize him, and get him to a surgeon within the golden hour, or he was dead. She packed the wound with combat gauze, applied direct pressure, started an IV line with shaking hands. Foster grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Doc, am I gonna die?" Emily looked him in the eyes. "Not on my watch."
Around them, the firefight raged. The platoon had finally gotten organized, laying down suppressive fire on the rooftops, forcing the enemy to duck and shift positions. Smoke grenades created walls of gray clouds. Someone was calling for air support, for medevac, for anything that could get them out of this hell. But Emily wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about keeping Danny Foster alive for the next 5 minutes, then the next 5 after that, then the next. One problem at a time, one breath at a time. She keyed her radio, her voice somehow calm despite everything. 2 urgent casualties at the MRAP, 1 TBI, 1 penetrating abdominal. I need that medevac now.
The response came back tense. "Dust off is inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Can you hold?" 12 minutes. An eternity in combat. But what choice did they have? "We'll hold," Emily said. And then she got back to work. The next 10 minutes were the longest of Emily Carter's life. She worked on both casualties simultaneously, monitoring Martinez's breathing, adjusting Foster's IV, checking vital signs, calling out instructions to the soldiers who'd formed a defensive perimeter around her. "You keep pressure here. You watch his airway. If he stops breathing, you call me immediately." They obeyed without question. Nobody joked. Nobody hesitated. They saw what she was doing, saw her kneeling in the open, completely exposed, refusing to leave 2 wounded men, even as rounds continued to snap overhead. Staff Sergeant Reyes appeared beside her, breathing hard. "Doc, we need to move. This position is untenable." "Not without them," Emily said flatly. "The bird's still 8 minutes out. Then we hold for 8 minutes." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, we hold." He repositioned the platoon, creating a tighter perimeter, directing fire with precision that spoke to years of experience. The enemy fire was slackening now. Either they were running low on ammunition, or they'd realized the Americans weren't breaking. Emily worked through it all. Her hands were covered in blood. Foster's, Martinez's, her own from where she'd reopened the old scar on her forearm without even noticing. Her uniform was soaked. Her aid bag was nearly empty, but both men were still breathing. Foster's eyes had closed, and for a terrible second Emily thought she'd lost him. Then she felt his pulse. Thready, weak, but there, still there. "Stay with me, Danny," she whispered. "Stay with me."
The sound of rotors finally cut through the gunfire. The medevac helicopter, a Black Hawk with red crosses painted on its sides, appeared over the rooftops, descending toward the courtyard in a cloud of dust and debris.
The crew chief leapt out before the skids even touched ground, running toward them with a litter. Emily gave him a rapid briefing: injuries, treatments administered, vital signs, while they loaded Martinez first, then Foster. As they lifted Foster onto the litter, his eyes opened briefly. He looked at Emily, tried to say something, couldn't find the words. She squeezed his hand. "You're going home. Tell your fiancé I said hi." The helicopter lifted off in a storm of dust and noise, banking hard toward the combat support hospital 15 clicks away. Emily watched it disappear over the ridgeline, her body suddenly feeling hollow and heavy at the same time.
Around her, the platoon was securing the area, establishing a perimeter, checking ammunition. The firefight had ended, the enemy melting away as they always did, leaving behind nothing but brass casings and blood. Emily stood there in the center of the courtyard, covered in dust and blood, her hands finally starting to shake now that the adrenaline was draining away. And then she heard footsteps behind her, heavy boots on gravel. She turned to find a man she didn't recognize, older, maybe 50, with a weathered face and the kind of bearing that said senior NCO. He wore the rank insignia of a battalion sergeant major.
He stopped a few feet away, studying her with eyes that had seen more combat than most people could imagine. "Specialist Carter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Sergeant Major."
"I remember you," he said quietly. "Helmand Province, 2023. Night ambush outside Sangin. You kept an entire Marine squad alive for 6 hours until extraction arrived." The words hit Emily like a physical force. Around them, the platoon had gone silent. Every soldier within earshot had stopped what they were doing and was listening. Emily said nothing, just met his eyes.
"That's where you got the scar on your arm," the sergeant major continued. "Shrapnel from an RPG that should have killed you. You took it while covering a wounded Marine." He paused, letting the information sink in for the soldiers listening. "They wanted to give you the Silver Star. You refused it, said you were just doing your job." Emily's throat was tight. She hadn't talked about Helmand, not with anyone in this unit, not with anyone, period.
"I didn't refuse it, Sergeant Major," she said quietly. "I just didn't think I deserved it." "That," the Sergeant Major said, "is exactly why you did." He came to attention, sharp, precise, parade ground perfect, and then he saluted her. Not the casual salute of daily routine, the kind of salute you give to a Medal of Honor recipient, the kind that means something.
Behind him, one by one, the entire platoon came to attention. 30 soldiers, covered in dust and blood and exhaustion, standing straight and rendering the sharpest salutes they'd ever given. Not to an officer, not to a senior NCO, to a specialist, to a medic, to the woman they'd dismissed as just Doc, who'd proven she was so much more than that. Emily stood there, surrounded by respect she'd never asked for, and for the first time in 4 years, she let herself accept it. Emily slowly raised her hand and returned the salute. The gesture felt heavy, not with pride exactly, but with something more complicated: recognition, acceptance, the acknowledgement that what she'd done mattered, even if she'd spent years trying to convince herself it didn't. The sergeant major lowered his hand and stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "You can run from the medal, specialist, but you can't run from what you are. These men know it now. They'll follow you anywhere." He turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing alone in the center of the courtyard as the platoon slowly broke formation and returned to their tasks. But something had changed. She could feel it in the way they moved around her, not with caution or doubt, but with respect that ran deeper than rank or time in service. Staff Sergeant Reyes approached, his rifle slung across his chest, his face streaked with dust and sweat. He stopped beside her and looked out at the damaged hemwrap, still smoldering in the fading light. "Martinez and Foster?" he asked quietly.
"They'll make it," Emily said. "Martinez has a rough road ahead with the TBI, but he was breathing on his own when they loaded him. Foster," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "If we'd been 2 minutes slower, he wouldn't have made it. But he's got a chance now."
Reyes nodded slowly. "That's because of you." Emily shook her head. "That's because we worked together. Your fire discipline kept us from getting overrun. Holloway's suppression gave me time to work. Everyone played their part." "Yeah," Reyes said, "but you played yours under fire, twice, without hesitation." He looked at her directly. "I owe you an apology. I heard what the guys were saying before we stepped off. I should have shut it down."
"It's fine."
"It's not fine," Reyes cut her off. "You've earned better than that, and from now on, you'll get it." He extended his hand. Emily shook it, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip, the handshake of one professional to another. Around them, the rest of the platoon was prepping to move back to the FOB. The mission was over. The wounded were evacuated. They'd held their ground and walked away alive. Barely, but alive. As they formed up for the return patrol, Emily noticed something different. The soldiers who used to ignore her now made eye contact, nodded in respect, adjusted their formation to keep her more protected in the center. Private Brooks, the one she treated for the arm wound, approached hesitantly. "Doc," he said, his good arm hanging at his side, the injured one immobilized in a hasty sling she'd fashioned. "I just wanted to say I was wrong about what I said earlier. You're the real deal." Emily looked at him for a moment, saw the genuine contrition in his eyes. "We're good, Brooks. Just heal up and stay sharp out here." He nodded, relief washing over his face, and moved back into formation. The patrol back to the FOB was quiet. No one joked. No one complained about the weight of their gear or the heat or the distance. They just moved, maintaining discipline, watching their sectors, grateful to be walking out instead of being carried. Emily walked her position in the center, her aid bag feeling impossibly heavy now that the adrenaline had fully drained away. Her forearm throbbed where the old scar had reopened. She'd have to clean and dress it properly once they got back. Her shoulders ached from carrying wounded soldiers twice her size. Her hands trembled slightly, the aftershock of stress and exertion finally catching up to her body. But she'd kept them alive, both of them, against odds that should have been impossible. As the FOB's HESCO barriers came into view, backlit by the setting sun, Emily allowed herself one small moment of satisfaction. Not pride, not glory, just the quiet knowledge that she'd done what she came here to do. She'd been the person who ran toward the wounded instead of away. And because of that, 2 families would get their sons back alive. The debriefing happened 2 hours later in a crowded operations tent that smelled like sweat, dust, and the instant coffee that fueled every military installation in Afghanistan. The platoon filed in, taking seats on folding chairs or standing against the canvas walls. A map of Qalat Shar was spread across a table in the center, marked with pins showing their route and contact points. The company commander, Captain David Hernandez, a West Point graduate on his second deployment, stood at the head of the table, his expression serious but not grim. Beside him stood the battalion sergeant major, who'd saluted Emily in the courtyard. "First things first," Hernandez began, his voice carrying easily through the tent. "Martinez and Foster are both stable. Martinez is being transferred to Landstuhl for specialized TBI treatment. Foster's in surgery now, but the doctors say his prognosis is good. They're calling it a miracle he made it to the hospital with his vitals as stable as they were." He paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "It's not a miracle. It's good medicine delivered under fire by someone who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier." Every eye in the tent turned to Emily, who sat near the back. still in her blood-stained uniform, her aid bag at her feet.
Specialist Carter, Hernandez said, I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device. You exposed yourself to enemy fire multiple times to provide life-saving treatment. You crossed open ground under machine gun fire. You stabilized 2 critical casualties in conditions that would break most people. That's the definition of courage under fire.
Emily opened her mouth to object, to say it was just her job, that anyone would have done the same, but Reyes caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. Don't fight this one, his expression said. She closed her mouth and nodded. Thank you, sir.
Hernandez smiled slightly. Don't thank me yet. Awards take months to process, and knowing the Army, they'll probably downgrade it to an ARCOM just to save money. A few tired laughs rippled through the tent. But the paperwork's going up regardless. You earned it.
The sergeant major stepped forward. I'm also recommending Specialist Carter for immediate promotion to sergeant. She demonstrated leadership under fire that exceeds her current rank. The platoon responded to her commands as if she was running the show, because in that courtyard, she was. More murmurs of agreement. Reyes nodded. Even the soldiers who doubted her were nodding now.
Furthermore, the sergeant major continued, I'm requesting she be assigned as the platoon's senior medic effective immediately, with authority to make tactical medical decisions in the field without deferring to the platoon sergeant. That was unusual. Medics, especially junior ones, typically operated under the direction of the platoon leadership. Giving her autonomous authority meant trusting her judgment absolutely. Reyes didn't hesitate. I support that recommendation, Sergeant Major. She's got my full confidence. Hernandez looked at Emily. Carter, you okay with that level of responsibility?
Emily thought about Martinez and Foster, about the Marines in Helmand Province, about her brother Daniel, who'd bled out on a road in Iraq because no one had been there in time. Yes, sir, she said quietly. I'm okay with it. Good. Hernandez made a note on his paperwork. Then it's done. Congratulations, Sergeant Carter.
The tent erupted in applause. Not polite, perfunctory clapping, but genuine, hard-earned respect translated into sound. Emily felt her throat tighten. She'd spent so long avoiding this kind of attention, running from recognition, trying to stay invisible. But maybe the sergeant major was right. Maybe you couldn't run from what you were. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing.
Later that night, Emily sat outside her tent on an overturned ammunition crate, cleaning her aid bag under the harsh white glow of the FOB's floodlights. The courtyard was quiet. Most of the platoon was either sleeping or gathered around a small fire pit, swapping stories in low voices. She methodically restocked supplies, fresh tourniquets to replace the ones she'd used, new IV kits, pressure dressings, trauma shears. Every item had its place, organized with a precision that bordered on obsessive, because in the chaos of combat, muscle memory and organization were the difference between life and death.
Footsteps approached. She looked up to find Private First Class David Chen, the soldier she treated for the shoulder graze during the first contact. He was holding 2 bottles of water and looking uncertain. Mind if I sit, Doc? He asked. Sure, Emily said, gesturing to the crate beside her.
He sat down, handed her one of the water bottles, and was quiet for a moment. Then, I wanted to say thank you for earlier. You didn't have to run out there like that, but you did. Emily shrugged. That's the job. No, Chen said firmly. The job is providing medical support. What you did was something else. You saved Williams's life. You saved Foster's life. You probably saved mine, keeping me from going into shock.
He paused, then added more quietly, My mom's a nurse, back in San Diego. When I told her I was deploying, she asked me to promise I'd look out for the medic. Said medics carry more weight than anyone and get less credit than they deserve.
He looked at Emily directly. I didn't really get what she meant until today. Emily felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Your mom sounds smart. She is, Chen smiled slightly. She's going to lose her mind when I tell her about you. In a good way.
They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their water, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional crack of a flare being fired into the night sky for perimeter security. Finally, Chen stood. Anyway, just wanted to say thanks. And if you ever need anything, extra security on patrol, someone to carry supplies, whatever, I'm your guy. Appreciate that, Chen. He nodded and walked away, leaving Emily alone again with her aid bag and her thoughts. A few minutes later, another figure approached. This time it was Brooks, his arms still in the sling, moving carefully. "Sergeant Carter," he said, testing out the new rank. "Got a minute?" "Always." Brooks sat down heavily, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured arm. "I've been thinking about what we said before we went out, about hoping you could keep up." He shook his head. "I was an asshole." "You were scared," Emily corrected gently. "We all were." "Maybe, but that's no excuse." He looked at her seriously. "I grew up thinking soldiers were supposed to be big, loud, aggressive, stereotypes. And when I saw you, I just assumed you wouldn't be able to handle it. And now?" "Now I know I was looking at the wrong things." Brooks gestured at her aid bag. "Courage isn't about size. It's about what you do when everything's falling apart. And you ran into hell twice to pull us out. That's courage." Emily nodded slowly. "You did your part too, Brooks. You returned fire even after you were wounded. You held your position. That takes guts." "Yeah, but I was doing what I was trained to do." "You did more than that. He struggled to find the words. "You made it look easy, like it was just another day." Emily smiled, small and sad. "It never feels easy, but you do it anyway, because that's the job." Brooks stood, extending his good hand. "Well, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're on our side." They shook hands, and he headed back toward his tent. Emily returned to restocking her aid bag, her movements automatic and practiced. One by one, other members of the platoon found reasons to walk past her tent. Some stopped to talk, others just nodded respectfully. A few brought her things: extra batteries, protein bars, a new pair of gloves to replace the ones she'd shredded during the firefight. It was their way of saying thank you, their way of showing respect, and slowly, Emily began to accept it. 3 days later, a Black Hawk helicopter touched down at FOB Blackstone, kicking up the usual cloud of dust and debris. Emily was on her way to the aid station when she heard someone calling her name. "Carter! Sergeant Carter!" She turned to see a man climbing out of the helicopter, thin, pale, moving carefully with the help of a cane. It took her a second to recognize him through the medical transport uniform and the weight loss. Private Danny Foster, the soldier with the abdominal wound. Emily's eyes went wide. "Foster? What the hell are you doing here? You should be in Germany." Foster grinned, weak but genuine. "They're flying me to Landstuhl tonight, but the convoy route took us through here, and I convinced the flight crew to make a 5-minute stop." He limped closer. "I had to see you." "You should be resting." "I will. But first..." He stopped in front of her, suddenly serious. "The surgeons told me I'd lost almost 40% of my blood volume by the time I reached the hospital. They said if I'd arrived 5 minutes later, I wouldn't have made it. And the only reason I arrived with enough blood pressure to survive surgery was because of the IV you started in the field." His voice cracked slightly. "You saved my life, Sergeant, and I needed to look you in the eye and say thank you." Emily felt her own throat tighten. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe, but you actually did it, and because of you, I get to go home to my fiancé. I get to have a wedding. I get to have a life." He pulled something from his pocket, a small coin, military challenge coin with the combat medic insignia on one side. "This belonged to my grandfather. He was a medic in Vietnam. I want you to have it." "Foster, I can't." "Please." He pressed it into her hand. "He would have wanted you to have it. One medic to another."
Emily looked down at the coin, feeling its weight, its history. Then she looked back at Foster. "Okay, I'll keep it. Thank you." Foster saluted, sharp and precise despite the cane. Emily returned it. Then, breaking protocol entirely, Foster stepped forward and hugged her briefly. "Thank you," he whispered again, "for everything."
The helicopter's engines began to spool up. Foster pulled back, gave her one last smile, and limped back toward the aircraft. Emily watched him climb aboard, watched the Black Hawk lift off and bank toward the west, carrying him home. She stood there in the dust and noise, holding the challenge coin, and let herself feel something she denied for years: pride. Not in herself, necessarily, but in the work, in the mission, in the knowledge that what she did mattered. Staff Sergeant Reyes appeared beside her, watching the helicopter disappear. "He came back just to see you?" "Yeah," Emily said quietly. "That's the job, huh?" Reyes smiled slightly. "You save their lives, they remember you forever." "I guess so." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Reyes said, "Captain Hernandez got word from battalion. Your Bronze Star got approved. Ceremony's in 2 weeks." Emily nodded. This time she didn't object, didn't say it wasn't necessary, just accepted it. "There's something else," Reyes continued. "They're putting together a training program for combat medics at the battalion level. Real-world scenarios, stress inoculation, decision-making under fire. They want you to help design the curriculum." Emily looked at him in surprise. "Me? You've got more practical experience than most of the instructors combined, and you've proven you can teach. Half the platoon now knows how to apply a tourniquet properly because you drilled it into them." Emily thought about it, training the next generation of medics, making sure they had the skills and confidence to save lives when it mattered most, making sure fewer soldiers died because their medic wasn't prepared. "I'll do it," she said. "Good." Reyes clapped her on the shoulder. "You're making a difference, Sergeant. More than you know." 6 months later, the ceremony at FOB Blackstone was small. Just the company, a handful of officers, and a chaplain who said a few words about service and sacrifice. Captain Hernandez read the citation aloud, his voice carrying across the assembled soldiers. "For exceptionally valorous actions while engaged in combat operations against enemy forces, Specialist Emily Carter repeatedly exposed herself to intense enemy fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to wounded soldiers. Her courageous actions under fire directly resulted in the survival of multiple casualties and demonstrated the highest traditions of military service." Emily stood at attention as he pinned the Bronze Star with Valor device to her chest. The medal felt heavier than it should have, not from the medal, but from the meaning. When the ceremony ended and the formation broke up, Emily found herself surrounded by the soldiers she'd served with. They shook her hand, congratulated her, treated her not like a subordinate or a novelty, but like a fellow warrior. Because that's what she was, not despite being small or quiet or female, but because when it mattered most, she'd proven that courage comes in many forms. That evening, she sat alone in her tent, looking at the Bronze Star, the challenge coin from Foster's grandfather, and a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from Private First Class Marcus Williams, the soldier with the femoral bleed, now recovering at Walter Reed. The letter was short. "Sergeant Carter, the doctors say I'll walk again. Might have a limp, but I'll walk. They said that's a miracle considering how much blood I lost. I told them it wasn't a miracle. It was you. I don't remember much from that day, but I remember your voice telling me to stay with you, and I did, because I trusted you. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for running into the fire when everyone else was running away. Thank you for being exactly who we needed when we needed it most. Semper Fi, Marcus." Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it in her footlocker alongside the other letters she'd received, From Foster, from Chen, from Brooks, from families she'd never met, thanking her for bringing their sons home. She didn't keep them out of pride. She kept them as reminders. Reminders of why she joined, why she'd chosen this path, why she did what she did even when it was hard, even when she was scared, even when it would have been easier to stay behind cover and let someone else take the risk.
Because courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about moving forward despite the fear. It's about being the person who runs toward the wounded instead of away. It's about carrying more than your share of the weight because lives depend on it.
Emily Carter understood that better than most, and in the years that followed, through more deployments, more firefights, more wounded soldiers brought back from the edge, she would prove it again and again. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because that's who she was. A quiet professional, a combat medic, a warrior who saved lives instead of taking them. And in a world that often celebrated the loudest voices and the biggest guns, she proved that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one you barely notice, until the moment when everything goes wrong and they become the only person who matters. Courage doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't demand attention or wait for applause. Real courage is quiet, steady, and relentless, the kind that keeps working when everyone else has given up. The combat medics who serve alongside our soldiers carry this burden every day. They run toward danger while others run from it. They make impossible decisions in seconds. They hold lives in their hands and refuse to let go. This story is dedicated to every medic who's ever crossed enemy fire to reach a wounded soldier. Every medic who's ever said, "Not on my watch," and meant it. Every quiet professional who saves lives without asking for recognition.
If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroism comes in many forms, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Share your own stories of the medics and quiet heroes who made a difference. And subscribe, because these stories matter. These voices deserve to be heard, and the courage of the men and women who serve deserves to be remembered.